Lisa's first international flight as a flight attendant was supposed to be a dream come true. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, learning every detail of the airline's operations, studying the safety protocols, and memorizing the procedures she would need to follow for the next few months of her life. It was her chance to prove herself to her colleagues. And to her supervisors, she had been looking forward to the excitement, the new experiences, and of course the opportunity to meet new people and make an impression on the passengers. But the moment she stepped onto the plane that morning, something felt off. She couldn't place it at first. Maybe it was the unease in her stomach. Maybe it was the nerves that had started to kick in. After all, this was her first real flight with a full passenger list. And she was still learning the ropes of the job. She had heard stories from other attendants about how hectic these flights could get, especially when they were flying international. But she wasn't ready for what would unfold on this journey. The passengers began boarding the plane, and Lisa made her way through the cabin, making small talk and offering a smile to everyone as she checked off the list of expected passengers in her mind. That's when she saw him. He walked onto the plane with an air of confidence that was impossible to ignore. Tall, sharp jawline, wearing a sleek, dark suit that screamed wealth. He didn't stand out in the way that most celebrities might, but there was something about him that caught her attention. His posture, his movements, his quiet yet assured demeanor, all seemed to demand respect without him even trying. But Lisa didn't think much of it. She had seen passengers like him before, rich and powerful people who were used to getting special treatment. She had read the profiles of VIP passengers during her training and had been told to be extra attentive to their needs. But she was determined not to treat him any differently than the rest. She had a job to do, and she didn't want to let nerves or personal bias get in the way of her professionalism. Lisa quickly finished her duties as the last few passengers boarded and found herself in the aisle near the business class cabin. She noticed the man had taken his seat by the window and was already arranging his things with precise movements. She wasn't sure if he was looking for attention or just being careful with his belongings. Either way, she took note of his seat number and moved on to greet the other passengers. Her supervisor had warned her that the business class passengers could sometimes be demanding and that it was important to keep a friendly yet professional distance with them. But it wasn't like Lisa to give in to intimidation. She wasn't going to treat him like he was above anyone else, no matter how much he seemed to stand out in the crowd. As the flight continued and the seatbelt sign was turned off, Lisa made her way down the aisle with the drink cart offering beverages to the passengers. She made her way toward the VIP passenger and asked him politely if he would like anything to drink. He glanced at her and then ordered a scotch without even looking at the drink menu. It wasn't unusual for a passenger to be this direct. But Lisa noticed the tone of his voice. It wasn't rude, just a little cold and detached. Lisa didn't think much of it. She served the drink and moved on to the next passenger. But when she returned to offer a second round, he asked for another scotch, and this time a bottle of water too. When Lisa returned to his seat with the requested items, she couldn't help but feel a little irritated. It wasn't that she minded getting the drinks, but there was something about his request that felt entitled, like he was testing her patience. Lisa made a mental note to not let it bother her, but as the flight wore on and the man kept requesting things, more ice, more napkins, a pillow at a specific angle, she began to grow annoyed. It was supposed to be a simple flight, and here she was running back and forth for one passenger when others were waiting. As the flight continued, Lisa found herself growing increasingly frustrated with the VIP passenger. His constant requests were starting to feel like a personal challenge rather than a simple service task. She had been trained to be accommodating to everyone, but this was beginning to cross a line. It wasn't just the number of requests, it was the way he seemed to act, as if she was his personal servant, without a word of gratitude or even a glance of acknowledgement as she passed by his seat time and time again. All she could think about was how exhausting it was to keep up with his demands. while also trying to maintain the flow of service for the other passengers who were just as deserving of attention. But at least they didn't make her feel like she was being judged for every little thing she did. Lisa knew she shouldn't let it get to her. After all, she had been trained to handle these kinds of situations without letting her emotions get in the way, but with every request from the man, she could feel her patience thinning. It wasn't like she could say anything to him, either not when she was supposed to be providing top-notch service. Her job was to remain professional and courteous, even if the situation was uncomfortable. And she kept reminding herself that it was just part of the job. She was new. She had to prove herself to the more experienced crew members who were already on edge, and watching her every move, the pressure weighed heavily on her shoulders. But what frustrated her the most was that the VIP passenger didn't seem to notice or care about the effort she was putting into maintaining the high standards of service that the airline expected. Lisa could tell the other crew members were beginning to notice how much attention she was giving to this one man, even though she was still trying to serve everyone else at the same time. They didn't say anything directly, but there were enough side glances and raised eyebrows to make her feel uncomfortable. She tried to brush it off, but she couldn't help but feel a bit self-conscious every time she passed by the other attendants. Their subtle judgments only added to the growing frustration she felt toward the passenger, and yet despite her irritation, she remained professional, offering him the drinks he requested with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, trying her best to maintain the calm composure that was expected of her. It was when she returned to his seat with the third drink that the moment finally came. Lisa had been so caught up in the cycle of serving him that she hadn't even realized how much time had passed. The flight had reached cruising altitude, and most of the other passengers were settled in quietly reading their books or watching movies. But there he was with another request. This time he asked for a specific type of pillow to be placed behind his back at a precise angle. Lisa bit her lip, trying to control the frustration that was bubbling up inside her as she looked at the pillow he had pointed to sitting neatly in the back of the compartment. She had to admit it was a ridiculous request. It wasn't even something she had been trained to deal with, but she had no choice but to go and get it. She returned to his seat and placed the pillow exactly where he wanted it, but as she did so, he didn't even look up from his phone, much less thank her. A small but biting remark slipped out under her breath as she turned to leave, something about how the VIP passengers never seemed to be satisfied. No matter how hard you tried, she immediately regretted it. The words were muttered in frustration, but she knew better than to show any signs of weakness in front of a passenger, even one as demanding as this. She glanced back at him quickly and saw him still staring at his phone, but something about his calm indifference bothered her more than anything else. His lack of acknowledgement felt like an insult in itself, and the thought of it only deepened her irritation. The tension she had been trying to suppress now felt like a knot in her chest. It wasn't just about the passenger anymore. It was about her pride, her professionalism, the way he had treated her with such coldness, without even thinking twice. As the flight progressed, Lisa tried her best to stay focused on the rest of her duties, but the encounter with the VIP passenger lingered in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling of irritation that had settled deep in her chest. It wasn't just the constant requests, it was the way he acted, as if she were invisible, as though her efforts didn't matter, and she was just a tool to make his experience a little more comfortable. Lisa had encountered demanding passengers before, but none had ever made her feel so small and insignificant. She was supposed to be there to help, and yet in his eyes it seemed as if she wasn't worth his time, or even a simple word of appreciation. The other passengers didn't seem to notice her internal battle as they went about their business, watching movies or reading quietly. Most of them didn't have the same high-maintenance expectations as the VIP passenger, and Lisa was able to get through her service with them without much issue. But every time she came back to check on the man sitting in the front of the business class cabin, she felt that same tension build inside her, like she was walking a tightrope balancing professionalism with her own growing frustration every time she asked if he needed anything else. It felt as if her words were falling on deaf ears, and the longer she went on, without any recognition, the more her patience wore thin. She couldn't help but notice the subtle glances she received from the senior flight attendants as she moved up and down the aisle. She could tell they were all watching her reactions, trying to gauge how she was handling the difficult passenger. But their attention only made her feel more self-conscious, as if she was under a microscope and every movement was being scrutinized. It was around mid-flight when Lisa found herself standing by the drink cart, once again making small talk with another group of passengers, when she caught a glimpse of the VIP passenger. Out of the corner of her eye, she had just served him his second round of drinks, and she hoped that would be the last request for a while. But there he was, holding up a hand and waving her over, without so much as a glance at the other attendants who were busy helping other passengers. She felt a surge of frustration rise within her as she walked toward him, trying to keep her face neutral, despite the wave of annoyance crashing over her. As she approached, he didn't look up from his phone as usual, and she felt the irritation in her chest grow sharper. He simply said, without any regard for her time or effort, "Can you bring me some extra ice and a few more napkins while you're at it?" She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself down, but the edge in his voice was unmistakable. The lack of respect was cutting, and Lisa could feel her resolve starting to crack. She nodded silently and walked away, gripping the drink cart with a little more force than she intended. As she made her way to get what he asked for, as she moved through the aisles, she found herself wondering why she was doing this. Why was she going out of her way to please a man who couldn't even be bothered to acknowledge her with basic decency? She tried to shake the thought off as she gathered the ice and napkins, but it kept gnawing at her. Why was she putting up with this? What would happen if she just ignored him? What if she stopped being so accommodating and just let him handle things himself? As she returned to his seat, she noticed a slight shift in her own attitude. She was no longer eager to serve him with a smile or with the same patience she had when she first started the flight. Now it felt like she was doing it out of obligation, rather than a desire to help. As she set the ice and napkins down on the table in front of him, she caught his eyes for a brief moment, and there it was again, that cold indifference that made her feel invisible. He didn't even say thank you, just gave a slight nod and went back to his phone. Lisa's stomach twisted in frustration. She tried to push the feelings aside, but they bubbled up anyway. She had done everything asked of her and more, and yet it felt as if none of it mattered. As the flight progressed, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was an unsettling sense of tension building between her and the VIP passenger, and no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, the knot in her stomach grew tighter. She had dealt with demanding passengers before, but this felt different. It wasn't just the constant requests, it was the way he carried himself, like he was above everyone else, and it left her feeling small and insignificant. But what bothered her most was that she had no idea why he was behaving this way. She had tried her best to be polite and accommodating, but it seemed like no matter what she did, nothing was ever enough. It was as though he was looking for something more, and it wasn't just about the drinks or the extra pillow. It was about control, the power dynamic that made her feel powerless. Lisa glanced at him again. As she made her rounds, she could feel the eyes of the other attendants on her as they exchanged quiet glances and whispered to one another. She didn't know what they were saying, but the weight of their stares made her self-conscious. She tried to focus on the job at hand, but the feeling of being judged was overwhelming. It was as if she was being tested by everyone around her, not just the passengers, but the senior crew members too. They were all waiting to see how she would handle the situation. But Lisa was starting to feel like she was losing control. She couldn't keep up with his demands, and she was starting to resent him for making her feel so incompetent. After a while, the VIP passenger stood up and began walking toward the front of the plane. Lisa was busy with another set of passengers. When she saw him heading toward the restroom at the front of the cabin, he moved with the same confident stride that made him stand out from the other passengers, and Lisa found herself staring at him, wondering what his deal was, what made him so special. Why did he think he could treat her like this, without any regard for the effort she had been putting in all flight long as he passed her seat? He didn't even acknowledge her, he didn't even look at her. And it hit Lisa like a slap in the face. She was trying to do her job, but it felt like nothing she did was being noticed or appreciated. She watched him disappear into the restroom, and for a moment she just stood there feeling like she had been used and dismissed. It was then that she heard the low murmur of conversation coming from the senior flight attendants. They were speaking in hushed tones, but Lisa could make out a few words here and their owner's son, and in charge of everything, caught her attention. She didn't think much of it at first, but the mention of the airline's owner struck a chord. She had heard the stories about the company's wealthy owner and his demanding nature, but she had never expected to be dealing with his son on her first flight. She had no idea why, but the thought of it made her stomach churn, even more than before. Lisa tried to focus on the task at hand, but the gossip from the other crew members seemed to follow her wherever she went. It wasn't long before she started putting the pieces together. She had seen the man make a phone call earlier in the flight, and now it all made sense. He wasn't just a VIP passenger. He was the son of the very man who owned the airline. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks, and suddenly everything clicked into place. The way he had treated her, the way he had acted like she didn't even matter. It wasn't personal. It was just his arrogance, the arrogance of someone who had always been treated like he was above the rules, above the rest of the world. It was a moment of clarity for Lisa, but it didn't make her feel any better. In fact, it made her feel worse. How had she not noticed it sooner? How had she let herself get caught up in the power struggle with someone who was untouchable, someone who could make her life very difficult if he so chose? As the realization settled in, Lisa felt a wave of dread wash over her. She had disrespected the son of the airline's owner, and she knew she couldn't undo it now. The damage was done, and there was nothing she could do but wait and see what would happen next. Lisa stood frozen in place as the weight of the realization sank in. She had just disrespected the son of the airline's owner, and she could already feel the consequences starting to loom over her like a dark cloud. She tried to push the thought from her mind, but it was impossible. The more she thought about it, the more she could feel her palms growing sweaty, her mind racing through all the things she had said and done during the flight. What if he complained? What if he told his father about how she had treated him? She had heard stories about the owner and how he didn't tolerate poor service or disrespectful behavior from his staff. The rumors about his ruthless ways spread through the airline like wildfire, and the last thing Lisa wanted was to become a cautionary tale that would be passed around for years to come. Her heart raced as she went through the motions of the rest of the flight, trying to focus on the passengers around her and keep herself composed, but it was impossible to shake the fear that was gnawing at her every time she walked down the aisle. She could feel the eyes of her fellow crew members on her, as if they all knew something she didn't. She knew they were probably aware of who the VIP passenger was, and she could only imagine what they were thinking about her performance. She had already felt the pressure building up, but now it felt like the entire plane was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, something she wasn't prepared for. As the flight went on, Lisa couldn't escape the mounting anxiety. She couldn't help but glance toward the front of the cabin where the VIP passenger was seated. Every time she did, she could see him casually interacting with the other attendants, his cold demeanor never faltering. He seemed to be completely unaffected by anything that had happened between them earlier in the flight, and it only made Lisa feel more exposed. It was as if he was completely indifferent to the way she had treated him, and that in itself felt like a slap in the face. She had expected him to react to her behavior, but he hadn't, and now she found herself wondering if he was silently watching her every move, just waiting for the right moment to strike. The rest of the flight was a blur. For Lisa, her nerves were shot, and she couldn't focus on anything for more than a few seconds at a time. Every time she thought about what had happened, she could feel her stomach twist with dread. She kept replaying the moment in her mind, the way she had rolled her eyes when he had made his first request, the way she had muttered that frustrated remark under her breath without even realizing what she had done. She had acted impulsively without considering the consequences, and now it felt like her entire career was on the line. The tension in the cabin was palpable. As the flight neared its final descent, Lisa tried to keep a calm expression on her face, but she couldn't stop her mind from racing. She knew that the moment the plane landed, things would start to unfold one way or another. She couldn't hide from the situation forever, and she had no idea what to expect. The rumors about the airline owner and his son made her stomach churn. Even more, the stories of how quickly he could ruin someone's career with just a word or a single complaint had always seemed like exaggerated tales. But now that she was in this position, she couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to them. As the seatbelt sign came on and the plane began its descent, Lisa walked down the aisles for the final time. She could hear the hum of conversations around her, but all she could focus on was the fear creeping into her chest with every passing second. She couldn't help but glance up at the VIP passenger as he sat there calmly reading his phone, as if nothing had happened, as if everything was just as it should be. But Lisa couldn't escape the feeling that everything had already changed. Everything was about to change, and there was nothing she could do but wait for the landing and the consequences that would follow. The plane finally touched down, and the smooth hum of the engines slowly faded. As the wheels hit the runway, Lisa felt her heart pounding in her chest. The fear that had been gnawing at her since the realization set in was now a full-on storm inside her. The rest of the passengers began gathering their things, preparing to disembark. But Lisa couldn't move. She was frozen in place. Her legs felt like jelly, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts of what could happen next. She knew she had to get back to her duties. There was no way to avoid the inevitable, but every step toward the front of the cabin felt heavier than the last. Her eyes darted nervously between the other attendants, but no one seemed to be looking at her with anything more than polite disinterest. She knew they were aware of what had happened with the VIP passenger, and every time she caught someone's eye, she felt a wave of dread crash over her. They didn't need to say anything for her to feel the judgment. She forced herself to keep moving as the passengers began filing out of the plane. One by one, she kept her focus on the tasks in front of her clearing trays and helping with the luggage, but in the back of her mind, all she could think about was the moment when she would have to face the consequences. She had been trying to avoid it, but it felt like a countdown ticking down with every passing second. The longer she tried to ignore it, the harder it became to deny that something was about to happen. She couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine. There was too much tension, too much uncertainty hanging in the air, and she felt completely powerless to change it. As the final few passengers made their way off the plane, she caught a glimpse of the VIP passenger again. This time, he was standing in the aisle waiting to exit. As he passed by her seat, he offered her a polite smile, but his eyes were cold and distant. He didn't say anything, just a simple nod of acknowledgement, but Lisa could feel the weight of his gaze, as if he was sizing her up. In that brief moment, she felt like he knew exactly what she was thinking. But then he turned away and disappeared into the crowd of passengers disembarking. Lisa stood there, staring after him, unable to shake the feeling that everything had just changed. That moment had been her last chance to redeem herself, and she had missed it now. There was nothing she could do but wait. She finished her tasks as quickly as possible, trying to avoid any more unnecessary interactions with the other crew members. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the passenger she had disrespected, and what he might say when he spoke to his father, the airline owner. She couldn't imagine how it would all play out, but the stories she had heard about the owner's temper and how he took care of things made her blood run cold. She didn't want to believe it, but the possibility of losing her job over a single careless moment seemed very real. As she made her way to the staff area at the back of the plane to prepare for the post-flight debrief, she could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her. But no one said a word. They simply continued with their tasks. As if everything were normal, Lisa tried to ignore the unease growing in the pit of her stomach. But it was impossible. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to be called out. For what she had done, she couldn't stop replaying every interaction with the VIP passenger in her mind, wondering if she could have handled it differently, if she had just kept her emotions in check, if she had been more patient or more understanding. But the truth was, it was too late for regrets. She had made her choices, and now she would have to live with them. When the cabin manager called for everyone to gather for the debrief, Lisa felt her breath catch in her throat. She knew what was coming. She had seen enough to know that the airline's management didn't tolerate mistakes, especially when it came to VIPs and their families. She tried to steady her nerves as she joined the others, but her mind was racing, the thousand thoughts, none of them comforting, none of them helpful. All she could do was wait for the conversation to unfold. The plane finally touched down, and the smooth hum of the engines slowly faded as the wheels hit the runway. Lisa felt her heart pounding in her chest. The fear that had been gnawing at her since the realization set in was now a full-on storm inside her. The rest of the passengers began gathering their things, preparing to disembark. But Lisa couldn't move. She was frozen in place. Her legs felt like jelly, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts of what could happen next. She knew she had to get back to her duties. There was no way to avoid the inevitable, but every step toward the front of the cabin felt heavier than the last. Her eyes darted nervously between the other attendants, but no one seemed to be looking at her with anything more than polite disinterest. She knew they were aware of what had happened with the VIP passenger, and every time she caught someone's eye, she felt a wave of dread crash over her. They didn't need to say anything for her to feel the judgment. She forced herself to keep moving as the passengers began filing out of the plane. One by one, she kept her focus on the tasks in front of her clearing trays and helping with the luggage. But in the back of her mind, all she could think about was the moment when she would have to face the consequences. She had been trying to avoid it, but it felt like a countdown ticking down with every passing second. The longer she tried to ignore it, the harder it became to deny that something was about to happen. She couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine. There was too much tension, too much uncertainty hanging in the air, and she felt completely powerless to change it. As the final few passengers made their way off the plane, she caught a glimpse of the VIP passenger again. This time, he was standing in the aisle waiting to exit. As he passed by her seat, he offered her a polite smile, but his eyes were cold and distant. He didn't say anything, just a simple nod of acknowledgement, but Lisa could feel the weight of his gaze, as if he was sizing her up in that brief moment. She felt like he knew exactly what she was thinking. But then he turned away and disappeared into the crowd of passengers disembarking. Lisa stood there, staring after him, unable to shake the feeling that everything had just changed. That moment had been her last chance to redeem herself, and she had missed it now. There was nothing she could do but wait. She finished her tasks as quickly as possible, trying to avoid any more unnecessary interactions with the other crew members. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the passenger she had disrespected, and what he might say when he spoke to his father, the airline owner. She couldn't imagine how it would all play out, but the stories she had heard about the owner's temper and how he took care of things made her blood run cold. She didn't want to believe it, but the possibility of losing her job over a single careless moment seemed very real. As she made her way to the staff area at the back of the plane to prepare for the post-flight debrief, she could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her. But no one said a word. They simply continued with their tasks. As if everything were normal, Lisa tried to ignore the unease growing in the pit of her stomach. But it was impossible. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to be called out for what she had done. She couldn't stop replaying every interaction with the VIP passenger in her mind, wondering if she could have handled it differently, if she had just kept her emotions in check, if she had been more patient or more understanding, but the truth was it was too late for regrets. She had made her choices, and now she would have to live with them. When the cabin manager called for everyone to gather for the debrief, Lisa felt her breath catch in her throat. She knew what was coming. She had seen enough to know that the airline's management didn't tolerate mistakes, especially when it came to VIPs and their families. She tried to steady her nerves as she joined the others, but her mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them comforting, none of them helpful. All she could do was wait for the conversation to unfold. The rest of the debrief went by in a blur for Lisa. She felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety churning inside her. She had avoided the worst-case scenario, but the unease still lingered like a shadow that refused to leave her. No matter how hard she tried to push it away, the cabin manager moved on to other matters, discussing future improvements and how to better handle difficult passengers. But Lisa wasn't listening anymore. Her mind kept returning to the brief exchange she had just had. The tension in the room was still palpable, even though the meeting had resumed, and Lisa could feel her colleagues glancing at her every now and then. She knew they had all noticed her slip-up, and now they were silently waiting to see how she would handle it. Would she crumble under the pressure, or would she rise above it? She wasn't sure, but she knew she had to keep going. As the meeting finally concluded, Lisa gathered her things and made her way out of the room, the weight of the cabin manager's words still hanging in her mind. She had been given a second chance, but that didn't mean everything was fine now. She couldn't let her guard down just because she had avoided immediate punishment. She still had to prove herself. She still had to show that she could handle the pressure of being a flight attendant, especially with demanding passengers who thought the rules didn't apply to them. Lisa's thoughts raced as she walked down the narrow hallway toward the crew area. The other attendants were already chatting among themselves, but Lisa kept to herself. She didn't want to get caught up in any conversations that might make her feel more exposed than she already did. It was hard enough to carry the weight of her own embarrassment without having to relive it through the whispers of others. She decided to head straight for the break room, where she could gather her thoughts and take a few minutes to breathe without the prying eyes of her colleagues. Once inside the break room, Lisa sank into one of the chairs, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on the table. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to calm herself. She had made it through the debrief, but that didn't mean it was over. She knew she couldn't let her guard down. She couldn't let that moment of weakness define her. She had to move forward and prove to everyone, including herself, that she could handle the job with the level of professionalism it required. She had made one mistake, but she wasn't going to let it become the story of her career. As she sat there in silence, Lisa's mind wandered back to the VIP passenger. She couldn't stop thinking about him, his cold indifference, and the way he had treated her throughout the flight. He hadn't even acknowledged her efforts. He hadn't seemed to care about anything she had done for him, and that made her angry. But at the same time, she understood now that he was untouchable in a way that no one else was. He was the son of the airline's owner, and in his world, people like Lisa were just small pieces in a much larger game. He probably hadn't even thought twice about her behavior. He probably didn't even realize the effect it had on her, because to him she was just another face in the crowd, and that realization left Lisa feeling hollow inside. But she couldn't dwell on that. She couldn't let his arrogance affect her any longer. She had a job to do, and she was going to do it the best way she knew how, with grace and professionalism, even if it meant swallowing her pride and ignoring the way he had treated her. She wasn't going to let it define her. She wasn't going to let him win. As the minutes ticked by, Lisa finally stood up from her chair. She had to get back to work. The next flight was already being prepared, and she couldn't afford to be distracted any longer. She wasn't going to let the shadow of one difficult passenger ruin the rest of her career. She knew she had to keep moving forward and keep proving herself one step at a time. She wasn't going to let this mistake hold her back.